Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths animated trilogy from Aw Yeah Comics Skokie, our pal, sweet Bernie Gersmeyer. Welcome back.
What's up, Anthony? It's nice to be back, man.
Dude, thank you for watching these three animated movies. I feel like I owe you an apology.
I think you owe me 2/3 of an apology. That's how I'm going to go with it. That's how my review is starting.
All right, fair. So we end on a hopeful note. That's a positive. Yes. Funny enough, Warner Brothers Animation announced this trilogy right after you and I recorded our episode on the Crisis on Infinite Earths comic book series. Like, we recorded the episode, and it was right around San Diego Comic-Con 2023. Right. And then it was, again, I think hours after we recorded when news broke that they were going to be adapting this, so much so that I recorded a little intro that I placed at the start of our Crisis discussion.
Yeah.
And if memory serves, what I said in that little intro was, we don't know what approach they're going to take. I suspect it's likely one of these two things, and I would be happy with either. On the one hand, I thought that we might get just a straight, full-on adaptation of the comic book series, a la what Warner Brothers Animation did for The Dark Knight Returns, for example.
Right. Yeah.
Or I thought that they might go the Arrowverse route, the way they adapted it for television, where it keeps a lot of the same beats and themes and some plot points of the original comic, but filtered through the lens of that specific television universe, where you have all of these past folks from other DC projects, film and TV, coming back to these roles that they haven't played for years and getting, in some cases, a long overdue swan song. I've long said, and I maintain, that the Arrowverse, whatever faults it may have, really nailed it in my mind when it came to Crisis. Yeah. And so I thought if the animated version did either of those two, we would be great. That's not the way they went.
Not at all. Not one bit. I will tell you this, of all the things that you've asked, like, hey, you want to do this? I started with, yeah, and ended with, oh my. Yeah. It was a hard assignment. Like, and we've read a lot. We've done and talked about a lot of stuff. And for me to say that was a hard assignment, that's a lot.
Yeah. I originally intended for our discussion to be its own standalone, full-fledged, full-length episode.
Yeah.
And after watching the first two, I messaged you and I was like, hey, I think this is just going to be a segment or a mini episode. And the reason is, and I mean this sincerely, and I think our audience who's been with us, they know, while I'm always game to give my honest assessment, and I think that's fair.
Yeah.
And I think toxic positivity can be its own problem. So I think it's important to be fair and balanced. At the same time, I take no delight, truly, I take no delight in coming on and just bashing on something for like an hour and a half, unless it really deserves it. And by that, I mean the Flash movie. But other than something like that, I take no delight in that. And I know people worked really hard on this, and it's recent. And I know a lot of the folks involved with this movie, they're like active on social media. So I'm mindful of all of that. And so that's why I figured we have to talk about it. We did all this Red Skies business. Like, we got to talk about it, but I can't make it its own thing. I struggled so much watching these three movies. I think, like yourself, you've given a little hint about what your overall takeaway was. I had the quote unquote easiest time with the third one. I thought the third was the strongest, but it was really rough. And when I watched the first two, I watched them in one shot on Max maybe a month or two ago. And I was not in a great mood that night. I think this is an important life lesson. Whatever it was that was bothering me that day, I can't even remember what it was. But I remember I was not in a good mood when I sat down to watch it. And that might not have helped. Although, on the other hand, had they been strong, I think that might have lifted me out of whatever funk I was in, but that was not the case.
Agreed.
And those first, and then even most of this third one, I just found them to be, and I don't want to be reductive, I don't want to be flip, but I just found them so dull, man. Like, they were such a slog.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Where do I begin? So I was with you. Like, when I started with the first one, I was not I was not in a great mood. And like I was like, oh, you know what? This might make it better. I Anthony, I think the first movie, I feel like it was 70 minutes, right? I want to say it was about maybe 70, 72 minutes.
More.
The first one was long. Okay, so the moral of my story is like it felt like 2 hours. It was so long, and I've commented on how hard it is to get through the actual Crisis on Infinite Earths collection, and this felt worse, and that's a lot to be said. Okay. The best way for me to explain these movies, and I'm going to try to say this in the nicest, kindest way possible, is it's like a kid took all action figures of these characters and made up a story using all of these action figures. And they said, I'm going to call it Crisis on Infinite Earths. That's really what it kind of comes down to. Like, they're all familiar characters. If they hadn't called it Crisis on Infinite Earths and changed the villains, I would probably be less pissed off.
Yeah, I hear you. And kind of building off of that, because that's a great point. Have you or had you been following this Tomorrowverse line of animated movies that started with 2020's Superman, Man of Tomorrow? Had you been following all of them or most of them?
Enough. So I knew going into this, like, too, that like I know where the Flashpoint paradox and then the Apocalypse War, like where that finished. And I knew kind of where this was going, even like when you hinted and said, hey, you might want to rewatch. I went, oh, so this is supposed to be the end of that next chapter. Man, I tell you though, like, I just don't understand why they had to call it Crisis. It's an insult to call it Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Yeah, I am with you on that. Now, I'm not going to do a plot by plot breakdown of this whole thing. I don't have the time or the interest, folks. Yeah. And to be honest, from what I've gathered on social media, virtually everyone that I heard from either had the same reaction as us or hasn't watched these. So for anyone who hasn't watched them and maybe you're listening to us to decide whether or not you should, as of this recording, they're all on Max. So if you have a subscription, at least you're not laying out additional funds to watch it. But I would say if you're really more curious about the specific plot points, go to Wikipedia, you can read a summary and you can get a bit more of a sense. But again, 3 movies. I have to double check this, but I do believe the first 2 were approximately 90 minutes each. And the third one was an hour and 40 minutes. Yeah, because I remember there was definitely some sticker shock when I pulled that up and I was like, 100 minutes? Come on.
Bro, I fell asleep 4 times in part 2. I've never done that during any DC content, ever.
Yeah. Now, in fairness, I recognize how ironic it is for me to complain about runtimes when we regularly put out episodes of this podcast that pass the 2-hour mark. But I like to think we keep these moving and we have a lot of ground to cover. And so hopefully it never feels that way.
And the guy that watched the 4-hour Snyder cut at 2 a.m. for
That is very true. So again, not doing specific or full-on plot summaries, but real quick, chapter 1 of this, part 1 of the Crisis trilogy, is essentially Barry's story, where you have Barry Allen bouncing through these moments in his life. And then as we move forward through the story, the heroes from various worlds are assembled by the Monitor. And in this Tomorrowverse universe, primarily we've been on Earth 1, but there was that Justice Society World War II movie where Barry crossed over to Earth 2. So we had met some Earth 2 characters. But again, unless I'm totally blanking on something, I mean, that's really been the extent of the multiversal business up until this point in the Tomorrowverse. So that first movie is very much Barry's story. He's bouncing around. The heroes are gathered by the Monitor, and then they all work to create those vibrational towers to keep the antimatter waves at bay. And I think it was resonant. Barry slowed down time for him and Iris so that they would have time to complete the tower. And by the time they're done, they're essentially at death's door. And so I found that was that single aspect of it I found somewhat moving. But to your point, as I was watching, I'm saying to myself, why the hell didn't they just call this The Flash? Road to Crisis or whatever. This really was just a Flash movie. And then it could have been a unofficial or otherwise a prelude to Crisis. But it's really a Flash story.
Dude, I'm with you. Like, because that's a really cool idea, actually. If again, we're rewriting things that we don't need to. But that first movie, if we called it Flash Road to Crisis, that treats it as a setup, because the biggest point I wanted to make with you on this whole trilogy was I feel like if they added like 25 more minutes to the third movie and just made it a 2-hour movie with an introduction, I'd be fine. I actually would be okay.
Yes. Well, and that's the thing that kind of breaks my heart about this and ties together the past almost 2 decades of these DC animated movies. And
Yeah.
you probably know where I'm going with this, but I remember, I guess it was back in 2007 when Warner Brothers started this line of original direct-to-DVD animated movies, starting with Superman Doomsday. And at the
Yep.
time, there were no multi-part adaptations, and they had a very strict 75-minute runtime. And so you end up with something like Superman Doomsday, which
Oh, you're like
is
cramming.
in effect an adaptation of the death and return of Superman, but so much is excised or condensed, right? They consolidate the 4 replacement Supermen into one, right? And we've talked about this, it left a lot to be desired. And sort of for years, I and folks I've talked to, we've always been like, yeah, man, like I wish they could do multi-part movies. And look, with the death and return of Superman, we would eventually get that. They would do a 2-part one, and it worked a lot better.
And did it well. Yeah.
But I look at something like this and I say to myself, man, I think there really is truth to that adage that limits or constraints make the artist, because these filmmakers here had 3 90-plus minute movies, and it was too much. It was too much real estate, I think, for them.
Yeah.
I do think there's a way that they could have made better use of that runtime and had something that was a more dynamic and more engaging and faster paced. But that is not the way they went. But it's just kind of fascinating to me, because it's like, oh man, I wish they had more time. This is an instance where I wish it had just been, to your point, you could have done a Flash movie that tied into it a little bit, a Supergirl movie that tied into it a little bit, and then just get into Crisis, but make Crisis just its own thing. Because it really, what they came up with could not sustain a trilogy.
No, and I guess my biggest complaint when I was watching especially the first 2 parts, was it was so unlike the original content. I didn't even know what I was supposed to be watching. I didn't even know where to make connections. The Monitor story is so different. Supergirl's story and connection is so different. And again, I just wish if they changed the Monitor's character to another person, like it could have been Kronos or something, where it wasn't the Monitor. Don't call it this. It wasn't a terrible concept what they did. But when you tell people, it's like saying you're going to remake Star Wars, use all the characters, but then do Star Trek. That would piss people off. Like, it's very confusing. So I think that just rubbed me so hard the wrong way that I went, I just don't even care how this finishes.
Well, that's the thing, because look, when we had a lengthy discussion about the Crisis comic, and we found that binge reading that was a challenge.
That was a mistake.
we expressed a lot of respect and admiration, and we know that comic was crafted with a lot of care and attention to detail. And I think what we both acknowledged was that had you been a DC fan in the mid-'80s with sort of any level of history reading DC Comics, seeing all these characters come together would really be something. Again, I think that aspect was a little bit lost on us, but we could imagine what someone in that position felt like. Similarly, for me at least, like that's why the Arrowverse version worked so well. Despite whatever issues I might have had, Tom Welling and Erica Durance were back. We had Ashley Scott from Birds of Prey. I watched all 13 episodes of that as it aired back in the day, for better or worse. But that was such a thrill. John Wesley Shipp getting the send-off as the Earth 90 Flash that he was denied years and years ago. So there was really something, personal and compelling about that. And going back to what I said before, if they had made this a love letter to DC animation, if you had, whether these characters had speaking roles or not, but if you had pulled in from Fleischer, Filmation, Super Friends, Ruby Spears, the DCAU, and there is a little bit of that, but it is so fleeting.
And it's so not enough to make up for the first 2 movies. Because like I said, I think my stance is movie 3. And if you read through, I was reading the IMDb reviews and other things going like, am I just a grumpy old bitch about these movies? And I read them going, nope, Everybody's out there. And the biggest commonality was, why did they do 3? Like, you just set and again, like you said, we're so usually give us more. And I guess I see what they tried to do in the 3rd movie. I actually thought it was great how John Jones and the Martian Manhunter came back with Warworld. I thought that was incredibly smart. And you did see connections to different universes. But man, we should have seen more of that. Again, I would have been so happy with a 2-hour movie with a prequel movie and be done. I did not need all the Psycho Pirate stuff, dude.
Yeah, so we mentioned briefly what the first movie was about. The second one,
Yeah.
the first, I don't know, two-thirds of it, we kind of cut back and forth between Supergirl's backstory. We find out in this Tomorrowverse world that's been created here, after Krypton was destroyed, she ended up with the Monitor, and he essentially raised her and functioned as the surrogate father.
Yeah.
And we cut back and forth between that and Psycho Pirate's origin story. And then when we get into the last act of this middle chapter, then we have all of these shadow demons, not unlike the comic, and they come together and form the Anti-Monitor. So now it's like, oh, there's a form, there's a larger presence behind this antimatter wave. And then that kind of leads us into the third one. But yeah, again, it just felt like it just took forever, I felt, to get to that point. So that's the second one. Now we get to the third movie, and this is the one that it seems like both of us, and you especially, I think, got the most mileage out of. So I'll toss it to you.
Yeah, the third movie is where I felt it's like they were driving off the road, like they got lost, and then somebody saw a road sign that said "Crisis this way," and then they got back on the road, like, oh, and then it started to feel like Crisis on Infinite Earths, but it was really issues 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Like, it's just so sad that that's where they got back on. I also didn't love, I guess there's freedom in animation and creativity of art. I don't know why the Anti-Monitor looked that way.
Yes, I agree. It was just
it looked like
shadow.
A Mazo.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was like, why was that the choice when the Monitor clearly looks this way? So I liked what they were doing. I even thought it was a neat connection with Warworld, like and then Supergirl taking one for the team instead of Superman. So then you allowed the kind of weird, awkward moment of Superman being upset when Supergirl dies. It just doesn't. I think what I'm sad about is, for a group of characters that I care so much about, usually, I cared zero amount who died or lived in this.
When you get to that point, and you knew it was coming, it's right there on the cover. It's the poster for the third movie. You get to the point of Supergirl sacrificing herself. There's this theory that if initially Superman is planning to do it and then Supergirl takes his place, but if they can absorb enough sunlight, that can weaken the shadow-based Anti-Monitor. And so Supergirl undergoes this process and sacrifices herself, and then Superman carries in her body and walks in front of all the heroes and stands there and wails, just like we see in the comics and on that classic cover.
Yeah.
But it felt perfunctory. It felt more like they were checking off a box as opposed to something that truly felt organic in the story. And to your point, I think like that's the thing about this. It just, I didn't feel the emotional resonance with pretty much any of this. And again, I do think part of the problem is that while there were representatives from all of these different worlds, they weren't characters or versions of characters we had spent time with. Again, other than those the Earth 2 Justice Society characters, like their version of Wonder Woman and Superman, we had at least met them in that previous movie. But otherwise, it could have been anybody. And so it was really lacking on that front. It drives me nuts. I talked about how I wish we had more of these ties to past DC projects. Batman Beyond, Terry McGinnis is there for at least 2 of the movies, but he barely says or does anything. He's just like there.
Yeah. Well, and then the fact that they actually had Mark Hamill as one of the guests, like they actually had, there was Kevin Conroy's voice in there. And again, they're hitting the right beats, but it wasn't enough.
Right. And so there's this point in the third movie where all of the remaining, universes or worlds are being destroyed. And this is where finally, almost 3 movies into this, we finally get these looks at other worlds. We see the world of the Super Friends being destroyed. For a few seconds, they get a readout from their computer. They look at it and then the wave of white. We see the Justice League from the DCAU, and we have Jon Stewart and Hawkgirl sharing a kiss, which for those of us who watched, of course, that's something. But
that
they don't
hit me a little bit. I like that.
Yeah, but that's what I wanted this whole thing to be. Now, the one instance, and if there was going to be one where they stuck the landing, thank God it was this one, because it was Kevin Conroy's, the late great Kevin Conroy's last outing as Batman. And we knew this was coming, and this clip leaked very early, but it's this final tussle between Joker and Batman on the roof. And Joker has this line about, "Oh, Bats, you care." And he's like, "I care, Joker, about Gotham, about justice. And if this is the end, at least I get to go out being Batman." Like, it was great.
Yeah, that's it. Like, all right, give me 2 hours of that kind of stuff. And you could have gone through, instead of making it like an attempt at Crisis, make it a Crisis on animated Earths.
That's what I'm saying.
Like, they did a great job in the Arrowverse of honoring the Arrowverse and past TV shows. So I don't know why they didn't take that opportunity. And listen, here's the other thing that really bothers me. So you say you're honoring Crisis on Infinite Earths, which was made in the 80s. You're doing a remake that it almost seems like the writers didn't even fully read much of the original book. It's like they read Spark Notes and used that as the basis. Because here's where I get a little pissy. The Bleed doesn't exist then. The Bleed came out of Grant Morrison and Mark Miller's The Authority books. Like, if you like, where the Carrier should have been in there if you're going to talk about the Bleed. So, like, those kind of things, you're making assumptions that people just know what that is, or you're going to introduce it in a movie that is going to end and have nothing to do with anything else. That bothers me.
I think you're right that they were clearly pulling from more, because the Miracle Machine ends up being a pivotal plot point, and that's right out of Final Crisis. Superman wished for a happy ending. So here, I guess the big quote unquote twist, spoiler alert, at this point is, I can't imagine I'm ruining this.
Oh,
for
I
anybody.
just don't even, yeah, you're not. Yeah.
So the big reveal throughout these movies, you have this homeless man, eventually revealed to be John Constantine, spouting mysterious information. And then Batman, when he was on Warworld in that other movie, he had seen this vision of an older Barry saying, "Go back to before the beginning." So there were all these hints that there's something larger at play. And I mean, long story short, essentially this movie ties back to the final movie in the previous DC animated universe, Justice League Dark Apocalypse War. And what we find out in the conclusion of the Crisis trilogy is that when Barry, at the end of that Apocalypse War movie, went to create another Flashpoint because their world was decimated and they needed a do-over, that act created this multiverse.
Correct.
Right? Because as we learn in this movie, and this was not Barry acting fully on his own, but Constantine had a major hand in this. But essentially what you find out is that Barry went back and killed Darkseid as a baby.
Which is kind of messed up. Like that was a little, like, I was kind of going, oh, I didn't like it, but I was going, oh, that's pretty dark. Like that got real. And Barry doesn't do it, but then Constantine plants a seed where just Barry being there kills him. And I was like, oh, dude, like that was unexpected. Yeah,
he's just this carrier of death.
Yes.
But because Darkseid needs to exist in every universe, it creates this splinter, and it ultimately gives rise to this multiverse that we have been following to some degree or another in the Tomorrowverse line of animated movies. And I will maintain, and I'm not just saying this because screenwriter Tim Sheridan was on the show, but I really do still stand by Superman, Man of Tomorrow, which kicked things off.
Yes.
I really like the Justice Society movie because I love those characters and I'm always there for that. And I quite enjoyed the Supergirl and the Legion of Superheroes movie, even though they really did Mon-El dirty there. But I liked the movie overall. I really did not like the Green Lantern or the Warworld movies. And the Long Halloween adaptation, I put that in its own category because even though it's technically in the Tomorrowverse, it was an adaptation of that.
Yeah.
So in any event, though, we now have this bridge between the previous animated movie universe and the Tomorrowverse. And what you find out is that this multiverse is not stable, and the anti-monitor, and it's not just one, but rather there's a whole plethora of them. They're antibodies meant to try to quote unquote fix or cure this sick multiverse. And then the ultimate plan is to use the miracle machine to consolidate everything into a monoverse. And so we end I
didn't hate that, actually.
Like, that was fine.
Again, it was such a weird way to get back on the road. It was like, oh, okay. I feel like the movie, oh God, man, how do I even explain this? It's like someone read tiny bits of Crisis but didn't know how to get between those bits. They know they have to end up with only one Earth. They're not sure how. They're like, oh, well, I also read Final Crisis. Why don't we just use that? It's such an interesting way, but it's annoying. Like, if you know things about the DC universe, it's more annoying than creative.
I don't want to sound disrespectful, but you and I spent a lot of time rereading Crisis and talking about it.
Yes. We care a lot about this stuff.
But not only do we care, but it was not an easy task. Now, it's funny enough. No. Since we put out that episode, I heard from a bunch of folks, and I would say the majority fell into a similar camp as us of appreciating it for what it is, but recognizing it's probably not something you're going to binge read every summer. But I did hear from a number of folks who were like, I read it every year and I love it. And that's awesome. I wish I had that experience with it. But I don't know. I wonder if and I don't mean to question their motives or integrity or anything like that, but we know what it's like to go through that material. So I wonder what I'll leave it at this. I wonder what their experience was going through that material and what their takeaway was.
Agreed. And it's funny, like, even looking back at the original Maxi series, there's many series that I read now in the current DC universe that are Maxi series. They're 12 parts that I strongly believe they read better as a volume. That, like, I think Doomsday Clock read better as one read instead of monthly. But I'll be honest, I wonder if I read Crisis one issue a month, if I would feel better about Crisis.
You probably would. I think that's an instance where it's not really, I always hate, especially for people who listen to all of my podcasts, like he hates the Kirk Allen stuff, but I always use this as the example, but it was so hard binge watching those serials. They were never meant to be binged. It was meant to be like, you go to the movie and each week you're going to see a few minutes of this stuff, and you're probably not going to see all of them. So we're basically going to go through the same motions every time because you probably haven't seen all of them. But when I sit down and I pop in the disc and I'm watching all 15 of those installments back to back to back, I'm like banging my head against the wall. So yes, I think certain things are meant for that consumption and certain things are not.
Now, I want to go a few positive things too that I really want to touch on. Like, I really have actually loved the style, the animation, I guess the production value of all of the animated films as far back as that Flashpoint Paradox when it began 2 universes ago. I've really appreciated everything. I am not, it's hard. I worry that sometimes when we get negative, people hear us as like angry fans, but like, no, there's a difference between critique and angry fans just being angry. Like, Star Wars fans right now, I think, are just angry fans. Those are frustrating people. I love what they were doing in that whole previous universe. I really loved Apocalypse War. Like, I finished that movie going, this was a really well thought out thing. This last universe, like you were just saying, I know they've tried to connect them, but they were very distinctly different also. And I think they weren't as, in my opinion, as thought out as the previous animated universe. So if I'm critiquing, I think this was less linear, which then made Crisis hard to really digest.
Well, yes, because that's the thing. This Tomorrowverse line, and I honestly, I don't know how far in advance they knew they were building to Crisis, because I also can't help but wonder, this movie really wraps up clearly the Tomorrowverse, and you could argue all of the previous DC animated worlds that came before it. And I wonder how much of that is due to the fact that we now have a new overlord in the form of James Gunn, who has animated projects that are tying into his new world that he's doing. So I don't know, were they originally anticipating having more runway and more movies to get to this point? Because one of the things when you watch the Tomorrowverse, and for our audience, we did a Patreon episode at the beginning of 2023 on the Supergirl, Green Lantern, Justice Society, and Warworld movies. So if anyone's curious to listen to that, we did talk about them. But it's really, the timeline of those movies is weird because you skip over the formation of the Justice League.
Yes.
But then when Barry is bouncing through time, they fill in a lot of those gaps. And some of those kind of non sequiturs from the Warworld movie, for example, end up paying dividends here. I don't know how to say this nicely, but I wonder how invested people were in the Tomorrowverse such that they were really craving for those kind of callbacks or tie-ins. And I also wonder, tying this back into Apocalypse War, I genuinely wonder how many folks who were a fan of the previous animated universe were really on board with Tomorrowverse at this point.
Agreed. Like, how many stuck around?
And on the flip side, like for myself, I only watched a few of the movies from that prior run. I had never seen Apocalypse War, but as I was watching Crisis Part 3, I was like, oh, I've been down this road enough times. I was like, all right, I see what they're doing. So I pulled up on YouTube. I just paused it. And I was like, all right, Apocalypse War ending. And I watched them. All right, I get what they're doing here.
Yeah.
But I would have to imagine and especially for more casual fans, if you hadn't watched Apocalypse War and you're watching that, what the hell do you make of this? So I guess my question is, who is this for?
Yeah. And I think that was a question I was asking, because if it's not for me, if you titled it Crisis on Infinite Earths, and you did 3 parts of one of the most well-known massive storylines in the entire DC universe, if it's not for me who actually knows it, who is it for? And that's, I think, where my frustration was. So that's all I got.
That's pretty much all I got too. I think the most positive thing I can say at the very end, when all of our heroes and villains are literally making that leap into that new world that's being created, and they're converted into this beam of light, and they're sent down. And this idea of there are multiple versions of you now, but when you go through this portal, so to speak, and you end up on this, we're going to have a new consolidated shared history. You don't know what it's going to be. There was something to that, and the Question decides not to. He walks away. I was like, oh wow, like that's perfectly in character.
It's so funny that the last 5 minutes of the movie was my favorite part of the entire trilogy.
Yeah. No, I thought that was good. And then going back to the final Kevin Conroy line, it called to mind to me one of my favorite Batman comic book stories, Whatever Happened to the Caped Crusader, because there's that line in that book, the only reward you get for being Batman is you get to be Batman. And Batman articulates earlier in that story that him being Batman really is that constant. He's like, I protect the innocent, I correct the guilty. I'm Batman. Like, that's it.
That's it.
And so to kind of have all of that distilled into that exchange that we got there, that to me, and honestly, given the untimely and very sad passing of Kevin Conroy, maybe this is the most positive note we can end on, which is maybe these 3 movies were worth it to get that little scene with him. Because if you have to put any kind of bow on Kevin Conroy as Batman, I think that was pretty perfect.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So I don't know. Again, I think that's all we have here. I would be very, very hard pressed to recommend this trilogy to anybody. I would say, if you're curious enough, watch the third one. Or if you're a huge Flash fan, watch the first one. But otherwise, I would say just watch the third one. You can read a summary of the first. They don't give you a recap, which kind of annoyed me. I'm like, give me a freaking recap. I don't remember all of this. But
agreed.
But watch the third one, if nothing else. There's some good stuff in there.
Or honestly, how long was it to watch all 3? How many hours?
4.5 hours ish, I guess.
Watch the Arrowverse one. You got the same amount of time.
Or watch the Snyder Cut. Okay. So. All right. Listen, I thank you. A part of me says, I feel bad I made Bernie watch 4.5 hours of this. I mean, we had a half-hour conversation, but I think we said what we needed to say.
We're good.
All right. Well, thank you, Bernie. Thank you, audience. Keep tuning in. And as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Another Exciting Episode in the Adventures of Superman, an episode-by-episode breakdown of the classic George Reeves television show, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all.